Okay, thank you. I'm going to talk about the supplement AIM-1, and I want to acknowledge that a majority of the work and a lot of the thought was done by Hyuni Kim, who couldn't be here today. So I've integrated stuff from hers into this. So AIM-1 was about looking at data describing human subjects and seeing how a variety of metadata models for describing that kind of data could be harmonized with the DAT standard. And we specifically tried to look at the OMOP CDM model and at NIH Common Data Elements. And so we spent a lot of time mapping these various metadata standards to DATs, and you can see here some of the standards that we mapped. We also, I should say, the Hyuni and the UCSD team looked at 100 journal articles and created search scenarios, really use cases from those journal articles. And then this group also worked with people at the NLM CDE repository to create the workshop on May 9th, which Ian and I will talk about in a few minutes. So the main findings of this supplement have been that human subjects data usually calls attention to a level of data below the data set, to attributes of individuals, and that type of data or that level of data maps to the dimension entity in DATS. We found that DATS tends to work well for standards, for metadata standards that are used to describe data sets used in secondary analysis, such as the CDISC standard or the Data Documentation Initiative standard, but it works less well for standards that are set up for clinical data. And in particular, OMOP raises some issues because the attributes that one would map to dimension are actually part of the data, not part of the metadata, and I'll talk about that. So the use cases that were derived from clinical research journal articles, what the team did was, after picking out articles that were specifically about observational or experimental studies, they asked the question, how would you search for the data set that was used in this study, and came up with 100 of these search models of the kind that you see here. And most of these 100 studies, a majority of them were looking at the effectiveness of a treatment, of a specific treatment or procedure. Some of a smaller number were looking at comparing different treatments. There were some on diagnostic accuracy and some others. The information that was most frequently used in these was medical diagnosis, but slightly over half also used the demographic characteristics of the patients in the search. And 25 of the use cases that came up were particularly complicated and combined more than demographics or diagnosis. Of the 100 cases, as you see here, only 34 were sufficiently searchable with DATS because they were ones that really keyed in only on the diagnostic information, which is something that DATS captures at a high level. The mapping exercises were done on a variety of these things, and as I mentioned, the DATS dimension entity is usually the entity in DATS that maps. So dimension corresponds to a common data element in the CDE world. It corresponds to a variable in the social science and behavioral studies world. It's called an element in CDISC OEM or a condition in OMOP. So what we found in these various mapping elements that it was this outlined area in DATS that was used in these mappings. So it's not goes to a particular area, and it used a lot of these extended DATS entities. Huni has written a bit about the problems of the difference between DATS and OMOP, and Philippe referred to a little bit this morning that DATS is a dataset-centric model, where OMOP is a patient-centric model, and it does create some differences in approach. So this is a diagram of OMOP, and I certainly don't expect you to read those things. I can't even read them here. But what you can see here is really that the central table in the OMOP model is the patient table. That's the one in green. And this is a somewhat more conceptual view of what OMOP looks like. And OMOP has this idea of conditions and exposures, which are used in these various tables to describe things. This is an example of the OMOP condition occurrence table. And the conditions in this case are usually diagnoses, which is something that, as we saw in the results of the analysis of the journal article, is something that is the most frequent thing that people want to search over. But what you see here is that the actual diagnosis is part of the data. So the format of this OMOP table is a general one. And if you want to know which diagnoses are inside this data set, you actually have to analyze the data. There is in OMOP a controlled vocabulary where you can get the full list of what could be there, but if you want to know what is there, you can't get it by just knowing what the column headings are. Let's see. So what we found then is that if you're searching for data about human subjects, you're usually searching the dimension field in DATS, and that in an important use case of clinical data, the values of attributes and even the attributes themselves are described in the data and not the metadata. So this leads to two strategies by which that information could be added to DataMed. One would be if DataMed actually got access to the data and indexed the data for this important information, as well as the metadata. Or an alternative approach would be an approach where the data repositories holding these objects would, as part of their curation, actually calculate summary statistics about which attributes are found in a data set, and then turn those summary statistics into metadata that they could expose, which could be classified and searched on by DataMed. So either way, I mean, this is really a question about if we're going to do searches over this kind of attribute information, who's going to go to the data and pull out that information? Is it going to be DataMed, or is it going to be the repositories exposing it and sending it to DataMed? So we have some suggestions for further initiatives, and the first one is exactly on this, of exploring these two alternatives, which would work. How would you do it if you were going to do it with direct access? What would you require the repositories to do if the responsibility for exposing this information was part of the data curation process? And then we also have some examples of data sets that we think would be worthwhile to search strategies that would be worthwhile to add to DataMed, which mostly revolve around creating searches that looked for data elements. And so dbGaP, for example, a lot of the data in dbGaP has been marked up with the Phoenix common data elements. Similarly, the FitBur data uses common data elements from the NLM CDE repository. And we can talk about this some more either now or some more when we talk about the common data elements discussion. We think that these would be worthwhile initiatives to explore this kind of deeper kind of searching in DataMed. So that's where I'll stop.